Hey everyone, before we get on with today's episode, I just want to remind you that our producer, Monday Abu's book, Igala Women, is now on sale on Amazon. So check out the link in the description. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Daily Wisdom Words podcast, where we talk to guests who have stories, advice, and life hacks, all of which take you one step closer to that feeling of hope. I'm your co-host, Neil Trevetti.
And I am your guest co-host, filling in for Maureen O'Day, Tiana G. Hansen. Thank you for joining us.
And today we welcome back one of our favorite guests. We've had her on last year and it was such a blast. It was an awesome episode. Shoshana Marcus, popularly known as Sho on her social media feed and our Instagram. So, hey Sho, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Why don't we start with, what you are doing. I know you've got a lot going on these days. For anyone who sees your Instagram, we certainly know it. Why don't you tell us, ever since last year, what's been going on, what you've been up to, some of the things that you've been involved in since then?
So last year, I think I was just doing crisis work, which basically I was working with adults who are struggling from things like schizophrenia, bipolar, things with those kind of mood disorders, those kind of hallucinating delusions, that kind of stuff, as well as people with addictions, self-harm, suicidal, homicidal thoughts, things like that. It was generally a step down from the hospital. So they weren't really hospital. They didn't need to be in a psychiatric hospital, but they weren't quite ready yet to be back in the community. So I kind of worked with them kind of in that interval phase, so to speak. So from there, I think it was in November, maybe October, I'd actually transferred to same company, just different department. And I worked with adults in residential, so they weren't in crisis. This is kind of where they lived, and they were generally people who are struggling with addictions. And if you know a little bit about addictions, you know that there's kind of a range of other things that are going on there as well. So for people who do struggle with addictions, there are a couple of things that usually would say commonly, because it's not for everyone, but I feel like for most people that I work with, it's trauma. They have a lot of trauma, and so they use drugs or alcohol, which is technically a drug too, but whatever. That's what I would say, drugs and alcohol, to kind of numb those feelings, those traumatic experiences, those memories, any of those PTSD symptoms, kind of numbing that. Another way someone might do it is for social purposes. So, wanting to feel belonged, wanting to feel like they have their friends and feel accepted. And the last common reason is hallucination. So you are hearing things, you're seeing things that aren't really there. They're not really there, but they're still scary. And oftentimes drugs or alcohol can kind of numb out those voices, kind of drown out those voices. So those for the clients that I work with. Now I still do both of those. I kind of pick up shifts as needed with both those departments, and we can get into this later if we want, if not. But I actually am also working at a restaurant because I have found that money is actually paying better than my mental health job, which I have mixed feelings on. I enjoy what I do. I don't enjoy because it's a little bit over minimum wage. And I also have a bachelor's degree, and I'm a year left to my master's. And so it's kind of frustrating that I'm getting paid basically less than a high school student would. So yes, that's my
I was actually going to ask about that, but I didn't know if you'd be comfortable discussing that aspect of it. Not you specifically, obviously, but just in general, the state of mental health workers and those. It feels to me like they're so underrated, almost like teachers are, underpaid and underappreciated. Is that the general scenario, overall, as far as what you do and people in that space?
Yes, it is. And I kind of want to trace it a little bit back to when it originated, when it first started. So if you think about pre-pandemic, nurses, teachers, and people in the mental health field got paid very low, I was about to swear, get paid very minimally. And the reason I believe is because when it was originally created, it was created, hot second ago, when there was more inequality between men and women pay. And obviously now there is still, that still exists, but not quite as much, I think, as it used to. And so these jobs, you know, those caretaking jobs, whether it's mental health, whether it's being a teacher, whether it's nursing, they're getting paid very, very minimally. And I think a large part of that is just because when these jobs are created, that's kind of how they were targeted towards, you know, the female population. So that's kind of my 2 cents into that. And then one thing I did forget to mention is maybe 4 months ago, maybe now, I also was invited onto a radio talk show. So I have a little section Saturdays at 3 p.m. And I can give you guys a link to put that on your YouTube. So that's another thing. Yeah. So
definitely. Yeah.
Congrats.
And it's really, it's really good. I like, you know, I've listened to like 3 or 4 of them now, and you know, I remember when you first told me, you're like, I have a podcast segment of my own now. I'm like, that is so cool. That's awesome. Yeah.
But yeah, that's my opinion on, you know, why these certain fields, I guess, are getting paid so minimally. I will say for the people, because I was talking to a coworker the other day, and they were saying they want to get into psychology, but they don't because of like the money aspect. And there are ways, unlike a teacher, unfortunately, and unlike a nurse, unfortunately, where you kind of, it's not like you can have like a nurse private practice or anything. But with that psychology degree, there are kind of paths you can choose to kind of have a better income, have a better, you know, living income, I guess. But in general, yes. And without those degrees, it's not great. I'll give you that. Yeah.
I'll bet.
That's a common thing I keep hearing with the mental health. And I know my mom works a little bit in the mental health. She's a student assistance liaison. So she'll go into schools, a lot of local high schools, some even elementary schools. She hasn't been doing much of that, but middle schools, and just speak with the kids and try to connect them with providers. Mm-hmm. And she said it's just been impossible because there's such an influx of students and kids who are needing it now, and everyone really. And she can talk to them and kind of try to like suggest what they need, but as far as getting them the help that they need, it's almost impossible because everyone is just so booked up. It's just really crazy. So I just want to take a moment to appreciate the mental health professionals, and I know that you guys do not get paid a lot, and I just want to say thank you for the work you do because it is so important, and I wish there was more out there, really.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's kind of interesting, I guess the word, how it's so needed now, but the pay is still not doing anything. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I feel the opposite way, because then are you going to tell people who are low income status that they can't have a therapist because they can't pay for it? But then if they're not paying, who's paying? So it's kind of like, you know, I can see both sides. You know, we want to get paid more, obviously, because I feel like if we do get paid more, there'll be more people who are wanting to be in this field. I've talked to many people, unfortunately, who say they love the work, but they don't want to do this because of the pay. And so you're already kind of excluding almost, not, maybe that's not the right word, but the people who are interested in it, you're already kind of dividing that in half almost. And you're not having as many providers as you could if we just got paid more, but then you also want to provide services to those low income families. So it's kind of like that weird balance that you have to kind of, you know, go in between there.
Yeah. And that's a good thing to note as well, because I know low income is really hard to get access to therapy. And I think that's also something important to mention as well, because it's kind of been viewed like a privilege to go to therapy, which I don't think it should be. Like there should be more free or accessible offerings in my opinion. So, I mean, in a perfect world, of course.
Right. And I do know there are some therapists, I mean, at this point, probably not a whole lot as much anymore, but there are pro bono services. Depending on your county or where you live, whatever, you can just Google, you know, pro bono counseling. And then there are some therapists who do that. But I also will say that their expertise and their availability and all that kind of stuff may not be as flexible as someone would like, obviously, because they are pro bono. So
it's kind of like, I know, like sometimes when I call like a hotline and stuff, or text a hotline. And sometimes it's really good and really helpful, and they've been really nice to me. But then other times I can feel a sense of urgency of, okay, well, tell us what you're feeling so we can, because I would imagine they probably have like 20 other people on hold or something like that. So it's like, yeah, I can definitely see how that would, it's not, I mean, it's good that that service is out there and things like that, but yeah, it's definitely not as ideal as it could be. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing with therapy in general, I think that is frustrating to me sometimes when I'm talking to people, is that unfortunately, there's no standard of how all therapy is going to be. It's not like going to like your local grocery store, Whole Foods, whatever, and saying, oh, this is what an apple looks like. This is how it should taste. This is, whatever. With therapy, it's different because therapists are people. So their style is going to be different. So for me, I use, I don't love, what's it called? Solution focused therapy, which is very like, this is how we're going to do it. This is goals. And obviously I have goals, but like very like, this is your problem. This is how we're going to fix it. Let's go. I think that it works for many people. I just don't prefer that style. For me, I'm more like, I want to listen to your story. I'm very trauma informed. So do you have trauma? And I think sometimes that's one of my flaws, is I think there's trauma when there really isn't, but that's another story. I just take a different style than someone else might. My techniques may be different. So I like expressive therapy. I don't use like sand tray. I don't have like, fancy equipment or anything like that. Some therapists do. And so when you go to a therapist, styles are very different. So sometimes I think the worst thing is when someone goes to a therapist the first time and that fit isn't there. So then they think this is what therapy is. They drop out, which I support, because if it's not the right fit, then yes, drop out. But they drop out leaving with the notion that this is what all therapy is, and it's not. This is just one therapist, one style. It's one brand of apple. You don't like Granny Smith? Okay, let's go to Gala, But I think it's harder for people to see that. So that's one of my things is, therapy shopping is not a fun experience. It's not.
I remember like a random example you had brought up last time you were on the show is that when you were dealing with younger patients, like kids and stuff, and one of the problems was that you said that you could give them like treatment from your point of view, but because they're still kids and they have parents, it might be a clash. They may go home and whatever you gave them or whatever you're trying to give them in terms of treatment, that may clash with the home environment. Are there some common backgrounds, contexts that you observed over the time that you've been doing this that sort of cause children to go in that direction? I know this can be probably very open-ended. I'm sure there are lots of different things, but are there sort of common tropes, common habits, broken homes, or?
Yeah. Well, I will say the first thing, just to kind of elaborate on what I said before, is that with that kind of scenario, I think I work with a lot of kids who were in very broken homes, parents who are kind of just done with their kids. So I don't want, any parents or families to be listening to this and thinking that like, I'm going to go against, what they want. Obviously, as a therapist, you want to kind of collaborate with the entire family to make it successful, even if that means kind of switching up your own style a little bit, just to accommodate, some cultural aspects, some, different types of family regimes. And that's kind of what we do when we work with families. But what I will say is that I've had clients who they're like parents wanting the kid to kind of be their co-parent. And what that means basically is seeking reassurance from the kid. So let's say a mother, she has a breakup with the husband and the husband leaves her. And then kind of making that kid take on that role as the husband. I'm not talking like, sexual intercourse or anything like that. But what I am saying is being that emotional caregiver, almost in many cases, unfortunately, also being the one to take care of all the other kids. And that's not a responsibility a kid should have. I will say that some ages, of course, like when you're 17 and you have a 10-year-old, like, yeah, you can like babysit your sibling. But more like an 8-year-old taking care of these 3 other kids, changing diapers, having all this responsibility. That's not something a kid should be responsible for. And so I guess to answer your question, bullying is a big one, and especially bullying at school when you don't feel like when at home you're able to express your feelings. And this happens a lot with that, be a man kind of ideal. And then what it does, it doesn't really, unfortunately, hate to break it to you, it doesn't really make you be a man. What it does is it makes you suppress your emotions. It makes you feel like you can't express your emotions. And if you do, then you're weak. So you don't, and you bottle it up. And so then when the parents or whoever, the siblings, cousins, grandparents are saying, well, why didn't you tell me this? The kid's not going to say it to their face, but what they're thinking is, I didn't tell you this because I didn't feel comfortable to, because every other time I've cried about my shoelaces being untied, or, a paper getting ripped, or, tripping on the sidewalk, you've told me to be a man. So why would I open up about this big thing? Because then I'm like super weak. And so that's one. Bullying is one. Just the home environment in general is one. Not feeling, accepted by your parents, or feeling kind of estranged from them. That can be another one. And obviously, any kind of abuse, any kind of neglect, as well as just like the neighborhood environment. So having a lot of influences that are, maybe not great influences. So we're talking about mental health. We can also talk about, substance use. So if you have a lot of friends, if your neighborhood in general is a pretty, addiction, substance use filled neighborhood, then it's very likely for you to get into that as well. Stress. So financial stress, other kinds of stress. I can do it. What else? Trauma. So it doesn't have to be abuse, but it can be, seeing someone pass away suddenly, knowing someone's passed away suddenly. Right now in Ukraine, that can be one. Adoption is another one. So there's obviously a range of different circumstances that can cause mental health, things to arise. I don't want to say that when something happens, you're definitely going to struggle from whatever mental health. And as we talked about this in my podcast, but basically one thing is not going, you need more than one ingredient in the recipe to create a mental health disorder. So if you just don't have support from your family, then that, I guess, if you don't have support from your family, but you have support from your friends, and you generally have a good life, and you have, your brain balances is on point and everything else is good, the likelihood of you developing depression, anxiety is lower than if someone who didn't have support from their family, who has genetic predisposition to depression, who is being bullied, who maybe has a low financial status, all of these kinds of things. So generally, not always, but generally, there needs to be more than one factor for you to be able to develop some type of mental health disorder. And what parents can do to help, it's hard to bring your kid to therapy. It's hard because in some ways it makes you feel like, I failed. I couldn't do this, so I need extra support. And that's a really hard thing to admit. That's a really hard thing to do, but it's not really something that, there's no handbook for being a parent, and there's no instruction manual on what to do when your kid is feeling depressed, what to do when your kid is feeling anxious. And, so it's not your fault at all. But what it is, it's something that your kid needs help for. There's this huge stigma, as we all know, with mental health. But when your kid has a broken bone, do you go to the doctor, or do you just, not go to the doctor? I think most people go to the doctor when your kid has a broken bone. And although you cannot see mental health, through normal eyes, you can see it on brain scans. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, literally every single diagnosis in the DSM-5. If you look at a brain scan, it does change the chemical imbalance, or it does physically alter the size or the activity of different parts of the brain. So that's just something important to remember. So when your kid does have, anxiety, OCD, whatever, maybe you can't see it, but it is there. And it is something that is actually very physical, even though it doesn't, appear so. It affects one of the most important parts of your body. So.
I just wanted to touch on something you said, earlier about maybe you see like trauma and everything. And I was just curious if you could maybe expand on that a little, just because I think it's very fascinating how you mentioned with the addiction coming out of trauma a lot. And that's something I've learned as well. It's often like, not all the times, because there's obviously other reasons, but I'm sure as a crisis counselor, you probably see a lot of different types of trauma. And I myself have lived with complex PTSD and done a lot of studying on like polyvagal theory. And I learned, which deals with like the vagus nerve. And yeah, okay, good. And I figured you knew. And so I just was curious because I learned in that course that like 99% of us have experienced some form of trauma in our lives. And I know trauma is also a very like different for everyone. Like just because like you and I could have a similar car accident, for instance, and I end up with PTSD and you don't, because we just process it differently. So I know this is a bit open-ended and long-winded, but I just wanted to hear more of like your perspective on like trauma and maybe why you think you may see trauma and everything as like a source or a cause. I'm very curious to hear more on that.
Right. So a couple of things of what you said. I think the first thing I want to address, just because I feel like I'm going to forget this one first, is that when you are in a car crash, given your example, there is actually kind of a way to avoid PTSD in a traumatic event. And so PTSD obviously is characterized by recurring memories, flashbacks, recurring nightmares, aversion to triggers, all that kind of thing. So it's basically how I think of trauma. It's a broken record, and it keeps going on, replay, even years, centuries, whatever, after the event. So when you are in a traumatic event, what happens is your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, you go into your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Not many people know about the fawn, but it does exist. Responses, and your adrenaline kicks in, all these kind of things, it goes up and up and up. So when you're in, let's say, a car accident, I actually read this in the book, but when you are in that car accident, if you're able to go all the way up and then bring yourself back down, so you're not sweating, so your heart rate is at a normal pace, et cetera, that is kind of a way for you to be able to not develop possibly some of those PTSD symptoms. Because right now what you're doing is you're allowing your body to not be frozen, in the past, to not be on that broken record. You're allowing your body to go through the motions of going up and then going down. And so that's one way. And there was actually a study done on soldiers who were basically in the war, and their gas that was given to them, and it helped them kind of calm down and relax. And during bombing around them, which is pretty terrifying. But what it was able to do is a lot of those veterans did not experience PTSD after that experiment. So that's kind of a way. That's one way to kind of conceptualize how some people may be able to, go through an extremely traumatic and not having those, those symptoms in someone else. Another way, kind of like what you said, is just brain process things differently, and what's traumatic to me may not be traumatic to someone else, etc. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about. And if you did want to read the book that is in, it is by someone named Peter Levine, Dr. Peter Levine, and the book is called, not that one, oh my gosh.
Is it Waking the Tiger or no?
It is, yes. That's really funny that you said that, because I searched Peter Levine, I couldn't find it, and so then I literally searched Peter Levine Tiger, and I found it. So there we go.
Yes. The one that was recommended in my polyvagal theory class.
Okay.
I haven't read it yet. It's been on my list, so
definitely read it. There's two. There's one that's Waking the Tiger, and then there's another one, I think one that's in an unspoken voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. So that's the one that I'm talking about, but really good book. For me, I think it's a little bit different. It's not that, yes, I do kind of see things and be like, oh, that may be a trauma response. But for me, it's kind of like, can be little things. Maybe someone says sorry a lot, or says sorry for things that are kind of that are not really that severe, and they, are a little bit anxious about it. That could be one that I see a lot. Another one will be workaholism. So working all the time, and I'm like, oh, are you trying to, avoid your other issues by distracting yourself and working all the time? And just, different things like that. And I kind of I'm like, is this a thing, or should I just because I'm sure people work a lot that don't have trauma, I'm sure that's a thing too. Somewhere out there. No, yeah, no, seriously.
There are people out there who aren't traumatized.
I know, right? But things like that, or people, make jokes, and I'm like, is that a way to reflect your inner insecurities? So just things like that I see. And I think part of it is for me, both working and having, people who I've known, on an unprofessional level. I didn't know it was going to rain today. People knowing on an unprofessional level, having, a lot of trauma, and my brain kind of being like, oh, this is trauma response. This is trauma response. And now, being an adult and kind of seeing it everywhere. But I always try and not jump right to, okay, so you have PTSD because your parents were terrible to you. I try not to jump to that conclusion with everyone. Because generally it's not a good result. So usually I'll just not say anything and just kind of let it flow how it flows. And then if it is actually a client, I'll ask them about it. But if it's a friend, I'm not gonna, say, so talk to me about your childhood. I feel like there was some trauma in there. Do you not feel like, your parents were good to you? I'm not gonna do that, because then I would have zero friends. Yeah, that would be bad. But
people who would stick around for free therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I was meaning when I say sometimes I feel like I see it when it's not there. Another one is this whole thing with sometimes people actually daydream, and that is a very normal response to being tired. Some people are zoned out, which is also a very normal response. And then some people dissociate, and that is more of a trauma response. So, that's another one where I'm like, are you dissociating or are you daydreaming? I don't know,
Yeah.
I guess that's the first.
But I think
that might.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're good. I just think with dissociation, that is maybe a bit easier to discern, just because if it's continually happening, then maybe it's not something else.
Yeah, usually with dissociation, that's harder to I guess snap someone out of it, so to speak, than zoning out and daydreaming. It's usually just as usually as I'm walking by someone, I'm like, you good? But yeah, that one, yeah, you're right. That one is easier to kind of know in the moment versus the other ones. But I think that's a pretty profound thing, because I've heard people kind of talk about someone's actual dissociation as zoning out, and it's really important not to do that because it's very different, and it's kind of invalidating to say something like that, oh, why don't you just get more coffee, because that's not going to help your dissociation at all. FYI. But also it's kind of invalidating that dissociation is not enjoyable, and it's not just what other people can see is maybe just a blank stare, but what that person is going through is so much more. They see warped time. They may see things going really slowly, going really fast. They may not physically be able to hear you. I've heard people say that they feel like they're underwater. I've heard people say that they feel like they're in a glass box. And that's, a truly terrible feeling. So saying oh, just drink more coffee is not helpful at all.
And what are some of the most common misconceptions that you come across especially those who are not as aware of, the mental health issues, from a scientific standpoint?
Mm-hmm. This is a loaded question. So I was doing this for a little bit, and then I gave up. I'll probably go back into it, when I get my licensure or whatever. But I had this idea of changing the word mental health because I hated the word. I feel like it insinuates that it's a mental problem. rather than a full body problem. Because when you have anxiety, when you have OCD, you have it's neurological, so it's in your brain. It's also in your body. Those cold sweats you get, the shaking that you get, the panic attacks that you get, all those, that's a physical body sensation. But then, of course, yes, it does also impact your mental psyche. So I was going to change the name. So that when people say the word, they're not saying, oh, mental health, but they're saying something that encompasses the mental part, the physical part, and the neurological part. So maybe I'll get back into that later. But I think, how often does it happen? I think that everyone who has struggled with some type of mental health, they have heard it. And if they talk about it, they probably heard it multiple times a day. I think it's very, very common, unfortunately. I think the most common one is that you can just choose to be happy. That's the one that I hear the most, and that's the one that irks my soul, because I'm like, oh my gosh, you know nothing.
All of us.
Like it just, my whole body is just like, nope. That's one I hear a lot. The other one is just be grateful for what you have. And like, just, that's another one that I can't deal with sometimes. I will say that yes, being positive and yes, being grateful and yes, going out in the sun, it does help with the serotonin. But when someone is in a state of mental collapse, they are traumatized, they are depressed, they are anxious, saying that is not helpful at all. Another one is, well, when I was younger, and then we can finish that sentence, whatever goes along with that, because I think a lot of times people try and put themselves in other people's shoes, and I know that that's what we're told to do, but that's not what we mean when we say to put ourselves in other people's shoes. But I think there's specific ones for specific disorders. This isn't an actual disorder, but with grief or mourning as well, because I just did a podcast on grief. As well as PTSD. Oh, it happened like 5 years ago. Just move on. Yeah, that's another one that I don't like. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there, but I think there are specific ones for specific disorders, and then there's the overall thing of then there's the overall mental health stigmas of well, at least you're not a starving child in Africa. I saw a meme about that. Those ones which are like.
Did you come across any toxic positivity in your job or experiences or clients, or have you seen any of that in the mental health community? That's
so funny you raised that, because I think you said something before that made me think of that, and I was going to mention it and I completely forgot. Anyways, yes, I do. So toxic, just for viewers who don't know what toxic positivity is, it's basically kind of like what I talked about a little bit before. Just be more positive. This is a choice. You can be happy, all of those kind of things. So it is positive. I'll give it that, but it's not positive for the specific situation. So you are, trying to encourage someone to be more positive about whatever situation they're in, but you're also invalidating their feeling, which is not good. And so, yes, I do see this quite a lot. The thing with my field, unfortunately, is that as I do have my bachelor's, but the organization I'm with, there are both a mix of people who have their bachelor's in psychology. There are people who have their bachelor's in something random like finance, and then there are people who don't have their bachelor's and are just hanging on for the ride. That was probably not the best way to put that, but that's how I feel sometimes. So yes, and I think that the thing with toxic positivity is that I think for the majority of people who do this, they don't mean poorly. They just don't know. They just don't understand why this is something that's negative. And I actually had a classmate, I was talking to a classmate like last year who also wants to be a therapist. And it was one of those awkward things where I'm like, I feel like I want to correct this because this is not going to go well with like an actual client, but I'm going to leave it be because it felt awkward. Like I didn't feel like I was in the place. She's also like 10 years older than me. So I let it be at the moment. But I told myself if it happens again, I'm going to, drop it. And I think in class the next day, I didn't mention her, but I kind of mentioned toxic positivity and hope she got the hint. But she basically said, I was just saying, like, I'm doing full-time school in my master's program. I have 2 jobs, and then I also have like a social life and like other things that I'm doing. And she's like, oh yeah, it is a lot, just keep your head up and keep smiling. And I'm like, okay, it's not what I was looking for, but okay. And so, yeah, so I see it a lot. And I see it more with clients, like I really don't see it a lot with clients talking to other clients. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they get it. They know what it's like to struggle with, X, Y, and Z. So they're not going to put that on someone else. The few times I have seen it with clients is when someone is in there for some type of cognitive disorder. So maybe autism. Generally, we don't take a whole lot of clients with autism, but if they're higher on the spectrum, they're a little bit more like they're able to talk and they're not mute. They're a little bit more higher functioning. Just don't love to use that word, but that's okay. Then we will take them. And so with those clients who do have a supportive family, they may say it to someone else who has, like, let's say schizophrenia and is homeless. But it's not like to be mean. It's more that they just don't understand that difference there.
Last time on the show, I'd asked you, like, that you advocate, like, end the stigma. I know that hashtag has been very popular, like very common in many of your posts. And I asked you if there's a difference. And I remember you said, actually, not as much as you'd like it to be. So I won't go there. I won't say, now, how do you feel? Do you feel it? I won't go there. But what are some of the ways? Yeah. Yeah. Everything should be better, right? The whole world should.
We only need 365 days. I mean, now we're golden,
Of course, yeah. Isn't our depression gone by now, or trauma gone by now? Jeez.
Yeah, what is that? No, but what I will say is that I feel like it's honestly gotten better in the last year, and I will say that because of COVID. I think a lot of people who didn't understand mental health, unfortunately, and I hate to say fortunately, but a little bit fortunately, did experience some of that loneliness and that isolation, and some people a little bit being a little stir crazy from being in the house all day, with depression, anxiety, all those different kinds of things. And obviously I would never wish any of that on anyone, but I think that being able to understand what that's like has changed a little bit in society. And I actually, like I said, unfortunately, I do work right now at a restaurant. So a lot of my coworkers are teenagers, still in high school, or, just getting into college. And so I was actually surprised on how mature they were. I was actually surprised on how aware they were. I was talking to a coworker who's like 30 the day, and it was funny to me, but I was saying, like, yeah, I'm surprised on how mature people are. He's like, yeah, they must be woke. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is, I guess. So now we laugh about that. I'm like, yeah, everyone's woke, Thomas. But no, I think that there's been kind of a change a little bit, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with COVID, with the school shootings. Obviously would have loved for this wokeness to happen without all of that. But I think sometimes I'm just glad the outcome is coming with a lot of G's in there. Obviously not here, but I think honestly in the last year it has made an improvement. No, it has not. There is still some stigma. It's still there a little bit. It's not gone away completely. But I think that in the last year there has been some changes. And I will say that I think also the fact that the younger generation, I guess, is kind of like, coming out through the ground now. There's more awareness that people are now talking about it, and people are now acknowledging their feelings, which is amazing. And I think the longer this happens, and the more, because then ideally what would happen is that these, teenagers, they grow up and they, have kids of their own, and they spread awareness to their kids, and it just kind of keeps going on this cycle. So I think we just need to, wait a few more centuries. But I think it will get better. We just kind of have to, I think it's just like a cycle thing. I think we just need a cycle it. So thank you so much. Thank you, Anna, for co-hosting.
Thank you. It was so nice to meet you, and now I'm following you. So I look forward.
Yay! I'll follow you back when I get back on my phone.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I will be in contact. Bye.
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 Thank you for joining us on Daily Wisdom Words. We hope you will join us next week, and we hope that you took some great wisdom from show.
Be sure to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. Thank you, everyone, once again. We will see you right here next week at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Goodbye.
See you there.